My name is Wiersma. As Martin said, I'm going to talk about communicating perspective in 17th century paintings to modern audiences. And this presentation couldn't be here without the wonderful work by Professor Elmer Eiseman, who's my professor at computer graphics, Dr. Ricardo Marroquin, and Johan Osmond, whose work I'll also be presenting here. So do look them up if you think this is interesting. Good, so I'm going to talk about communicating perspective to modern audiences, and where we'll end up is something that looks a bit like this. Something where you really see a painting as it is, almost like in a 3D version that the artist created. But we're going to start at a while back at perspective and when artists started using it. Because perspective is, if you look at the history of our whole universe, quite recent, and especially when we started using it in our image making. Actually, around the turn of the 14th and 15th century, the Italian artists started using it. And here's an image of Filippo Brunelleschi and a device that he used to create this perspective. But let's go a little bit further back on how we create images, which also one of the first devices to this is the camera obscura. And you might be familiar with this. It's the camera, the room, which is darkened, obscura. And in this darkened room, there's only one hole that any of the light goes through, which means that all the light has to go through this hole to be able to go in this box. And that means you can get sharp images on the opposite wall, opposite of the hole. And with this camera obscura, you can not only make pictures, but it's also a sort of nice and easy way to formalize how light goes through a point and creates images. And that's often also what we use when we create images in computer graphics. There we pretend that this hole that the light goes through is an eye, and then the image that's created, the image plane is not behind it, but we try to or tend to use it in front of the eye. And for computer graphics, if we have 3D models in the world, we tend to draw lines from the eye to objects, go through the image plane and find where the intersections are. Now, this is where we see perspective starts to arise, or where we can sort of study it. When you try and draw lines that go in parallel, or a line that goes from the eye, and draw intersections with the image plane, you'll notice that the lines in the image plane start to go up, or it starts to draw a line that's not necessarily like going away from you, but it's more going upwards on the image plane. And if you do that with parallel lines on a different location, then you notice they start to converge to something you might know as the vanishing point. And you might have used this in high school when you tried to draw pictures of cityscapes where you use this vanishing point to go towards one line. Now, around the turn of the 14th and 15th century, the Italian artists started using this, and it was really like a real discovery. Before this, a lot of images were flat, maybe had some layeredness, but it really added real depth to images, and it must have been very novel to users. So it might have been a bit like if I were to talk like this, and then go into a room with a bit more depth. So all the backgrounds, instead of being flat, started having depth. And as this might have been quite novel to you or to the people there, nowadays this is not very novel because we have pictures. So we are very much used to the idea of having perspective in images. For us, it's not very new, but for the people then, it might have been very novel. And you see that they used it almost everywhere where they could use it. So they used it to like fool people that there is a dome somewhere. If you go to Italy, to these places, you see a lot of this use of perspective. Now, how did these artists achieve this, or how can you start drawing this? Well, one way is to use central perspective. If you want to draw a floor like this, which is often seen in a lot of paintings, especially for Dutch art, you can start by drawing the vanishing point, and then the parallel lines that go out of the vanishing point. Now, this way you can start drawing the lines on the floor and see how they converge. But then you don't know necessarily how you draw the distances between these different cells. So for that, you'll need another vanishing point on the horizon. So you can draw another vanishing point, draw a line from that to the other lines, and then find the intersections to be able to draw it. You can also add a second point to be able to draw lines that are orthogonal in that way you can construct convincing 3D spaces in your paintings and images. Now, the Italian artists used this, but the Dutch artists also started using this in the 17th century. And one of the very famous people that started using this was Johannes Vermeer, and he's very well known for constructing very realistic 3D spaces, very realistic images of day-to-day people. And we know that he used this way to construct images because, one, we can draw these lines along lines that go to certain vanishing points. But when we look at where these lines meet, we can actually see that there is a little like hole in the painting to tell us that he actually used this to construct them. So if you look at an X-ray, you'll note that at the vanishing point, there is a little hole in the painting. And this was because the artist had a little pin that he put in the canvas. Then they attached a piece of rope onto it with chalk on it. And then if you snap the piece of rope onto the canvas, you had a line with chalk on the canvas, which you could use to construct your paintings. And you can see that here that he uses. Now, this has been studied by art historians, where they create these sorts of diagrams to study the paintings. And Johannes Vermeer wasn't the only one that did this. And Pieter de Hooch, which is another painter in Delft, also is known for creating these depth in his paintings. And this is an artist that we looked at as our group, because he was part of an exhibition in the Prinsenhof in Delft. And we were asked to try and see how we could use computational tools to study these paintings. Good. As I showed you before, one of the ways to study this perspective is to draw these diagrams. And if you want to draw diagrams by hand, you could take a piece of paper, print it, maybe draw it with a ruler. But what's hard when you do that is you do have to pick certain good lines and make sure that they all end up in the same point. So when we talked to an art historian who did this, it took them hours to carefully align these and actually make diagrams, which is not the work that you would like them to do, because it would be way more interesting to ask questions about how these perspectives were used, to study maybe the X-ray, see where these points were used. So we asked ourselves, could we make it more to like minutes of careful alignment? Now, this is work done by Dr. Amar Eiseman, Ricardo Marquinhos, and Cuderos Montt, who looked at a way to sort of provide an automatic ruler for images to find these perspective lines. And the way this was done is we first see where the edges are in the image. You can do this with a simple edge detection filter, something with these directional gradients that comes in here, of course. Then we select a region where we want to find lines on the painting. Then we fit the actual lines that were used. And finally, we make sure that the intersection points are optimized to meet in the center. Now, if we take this tool and apply it to paintings, because we can do it quite quickly, we can start asking some questions and looking at the paintings and what these lines do. So with this painting here, you can draw this segment and then see that actually there, again, you can find a pin. Now, this pin was found separate from our research, but it does show that you can sort of verify that these lines actually are there and that the artist did use them. You can also use it to study the same room, but a different painting. If you look at these two, I'll give you a minute to look at them and see why they look a bit different. So you might notice when you look at them that the room on the left seems to be deeper. At least that's the way that it comes across to me. And it's quite strange. Why does it look that deeper? Is it with a certain lens, or what makes it this way? If you look at the perspective lines and the horizons with the other painting, you'll see with the painting on the left, you see that the horizons actually don't meet. It seems like this painting has two horizons, one for the vanishing point, the central point, and one for the lines that were used to construct the depth of these tilings. And if you look at the other room, there they do meet up. So it seems that Pieter de Hooch either and that's a question we can't answer, but either on intention or maybe by being a bit careless, use different horizons to construct this. And that's the effect that you get. You can also study what this effect would have been maybe on the right side, and by simulating these different tiled floorings, what it would do to the image. Another way to use this tool is to look at two paintings. These are actually two different paintings that did hang side by side in Delft recently, of the almost exact same scene. But if you apply this tool to see where the lines match, you can actually notice that sometimes he's a bit more careful with following these lines, and sometimes he's a bit less careful. And also in some places when you have this vanishing point, so here we also know that there is this vanishing point used, the lines on the horizon, do they actually meet? Well, they do not. There is quite a large discrepancy between them. So the artist also used some freedom in this. Now, a question I had, which needs to be researched by a real historian, is perhaps he had maybe a smaller room that he painted this in, and he couldn't really attach those lines far enough away, but that's just my imagination that goes that way. Okay, so we talked about perspective, the way that the artist started using it. We talked about studying paintings from Delft, from Johannes Vermeer and from Pieter de Hooch, and a tool for art historians and for other people to visualize and show how artists use this perspective. And my question was also, how can you get this same effect? So what I talked about before of adding this real depth for modern audiences, how can we make some experience for them to really see, okay, this was what it might have felt like to first look at a picture that has this depth. And we started looking at maybe there are some computational tools. So currently we have a lot of nice tools to estimate depth in images. There are a lot of nice machine learning tools that are very good at estimating depth. And you can even do it maybe with like your own hand depth annotations. And with that, you can have a bit of fun. So if you have this depth map, you can start moving a camera through this image, which you can see here, moving through the little room that he painted. Now, this is based on work by Niklas. So if you want to try this out, do look this paper up. Part of this is you have to estimate the depth. Then you have to move a virtual camera through this room. And then finally, you also need to fill in holes of places where where the camera sees like a region that you hadn't seen in the painting itself. Now, some other nice results here is it really shows like how convincing the painter really made this for these algorithms to like work almost out of the box. Now this you need a separate video for. So if you're as an audience member in the museum and you're looking at a painting, then you probably don't want to like look at your phone. You want to just keep looking at the painting. So I also looked at a way to maybe add this depth effect to the painting itself. And we did try to do this with an augmented reality application. So if you have this depth map, you can also create a 3D model, which arguably is a bit simplistic. And then apply this model onto the painting itself if you're in augmented reality. Now we did this with a simple mobile phone application. So you could point it onto the painting, move around it, and really get this like feel for how it's coming out of the painting. I think if you want to try this out, there is still, I can send a link for that in the chat afterwards. Well, that's it. Communicating perspective in 17th century paintings. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.